In 1609, Sister Benedetta Carlini didn't just break her vows, she broke minds. What she did to the young novice under her control was so twisted, the Vatican sealed the records for 4 centuries. This isn't about faith. This is about a woman who turned holy sisters into instruments of psychological torture. And it gets worse. Benedetta Carlini entered the convent at age 9 with a promise that would poison everything she touched. Born to wealthy merchants, she was destined for religious leadership, brilliant, charismatic, seemingly chosen by God himself. But power without restraint creates monsters. The turning point came when she was 23. During a violent thunderstorm, Sister Maria Crocifissa, her closest companion and rumored lover, died suddenly in Benedetta's arms from fever. That night, something fundamental broke inside the future abbess. Witnesses reported her screaming at God, demanding answers, her grief transforming into a rage so consuming it would reshape the lives of every woman in that convent. The death wasn't just a loss, it was the birth of a predator who would use faith itself as her weapon. 3 months after Maria's death, Benedetta's descent accelerated when 18-year-old Sister Bartolomea arrived at the convent. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same dark eyes, the same gentle voice, even the same nervous habit of touching her throat when frightened. But this wasn't mere resemblance. Benedetta's mind had snapped so completely that she genuinely believed Maria had returned to her, reincarnated in this innocent girl's body. The first signs were subtle. Benedetta would call Bartolomea by Maria's name, force her to wear Maria's old belongings, make her sleep in Maria's former cell. When other nuns tried to intervene, Benedetta's response was swift and terrifying. She claimed divine visions, insisting that God had spoken to her directly, commanding that Bartolomea was chosen for a sacred purpose. The psychological manipulation began immediately. Benedetta isolated the girl, convinced her that resistance to this divine plan would damn her soul eternally. Within weeks, Bartolomea's personality began to fracture, under the constant pressure to become someone else entirely. What happened next defies comprehension. Benedetta didn't just want Bartolomea to remember Maria, she wanted to recreate her entirely. The process was methodical, brutal, and absolutely calculated. First came the physical alterations. Under the guise of spiritual purification, Benedetta forced Bartolomea to undergo painful rituals that left permanent marks on her body. Sacred scars were carved into her arms and chest, supposedly matching visions Benedetta claimed to receive. Bartolomea's hair was cut and restyled to match Maria's exactly. Her diet was restricted until her body shape began to change. But the physical torture was nothing compared to the psychological reconstruction. Every morning, Bartolomea was forced to confess Maria's supposed sins, to adopt her mannerisms, even to recount memories that weren't her own. When she resisted, Benedetta would lock her in the convent's underground chambers, leaving her in complete darkness until she agreed to continue the transformation. Other nuns were forced to participate, calling Bartolomea by Maria's name, treating her as if she had always been Maria. The girl's original identity was being systematically erased, replaced by the ghost of Benedetta's obsession. Within 6 months, Bartolomea would flinch when called by her own name, responding only to Maria. The transformation was so complete that church investigators later described her as a living puppet, strings pulled by a madwoman's grief. The culmination of Benedetta's madness came during the Feast of the Assumption in 1610. She orchestrated what she called a sacred marriage, a ceremony where Bartolomea, now completely broken and responding only as Maria, would be spiritually wedded to Christ in a ritual that exceeded anything in church doctrine. The convent's chapel was decorated with elaborate flowers, expensive candles, and silk drapes that Benedetta had somehow acquired through her family connections. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of psychological theater. Benedetta, now fully convinced of her divine authority, conducted the ritual with the other nuns as unwilling witnesses. Bartolomea, dressed in an elaborate white gown that had belonged to Maria, moved through the ceremony like a sleepwalker. Her responses were perfect, her movements graceful, but her eyes were completely empty, the look of someone whose soul had been hollowed out and refilled with someone else's memories. The other nuns watched in horror as this grotesque performance unfolded. Some wept silently, others stood frozen in shock, but none dared to intervene. Benedetta's control was absolute. The girl they had known as Bartolomea was gone, replaced by this perfect, lifeless recreation of a dead woman. The ceremony lasted 3 hours, with Benedetta delivering fevered sermons about resurrection and divine love, while the broken girl beside her smiled with practiced, meaningless beauty. It was the most successful psychological murder in medieval history, the complete destruction of one human being's identity to satisfy another's delusions. Benedetta's reign of psychological terror couldn't last forever. Word of the disturbing rituals eventually reached church authorities, who launched a full investigation in 1611. The testimonies they collected were so horrific that most were immediately classified and hidden in Vatican archives. When the investigators arrived, they found a convent in complete psychological collapse. Several nuns had suffered complete mental breakdowns from the trauma of witnessing and participating in Benedetta's experiments. Others had attempted to flee, but were brought back and punished with isolation and starvation. The girl once known as Bartolomea was discovered in Maria's former cell, still responding only to the dead woman's name, her original personality apparently destroyed beyond recovery. The investigation revealed the full scope of Benedetta's manipulation: forged documents claiming divine visions, stolen funds used to create elaborate ceremonies, and a network of psychological torture that had turned the entire convent into a theater of madness. Benedetta was arrested and removed from the convent, but her victim's ordeal was far from over. Church authorities, unsure how to handle someone whose identity had been so thoroughly destroyed, decided to transfer Maria to another convent, where she would continue to live as the dead woman, rather than attempt to recover her original self. The decision was made for administrative convenience, but it condemned the broken girl to a lifetime of living as someone else's ghost. The story's most tragic chapter unfolded 2 years later in the convent of Santa Clara, where the girl known only as Maria had been transferred. Despite the change of location, she remained trapped in the identity that had been forced upon her, unable to remember her original name or past. But something unexpected happened during the winter of 1613. Whether through divine intervention or the simple resilience of the human spirit, fragments of her original self began to resurface. She started having dreams of her childhood, memories of a different life, a different name. The realization of what had been done to her came gradually, then all at once in a moment of horrifying clarity. She understood that she wasn't Maria, had never been Maria, and that the woman she had become was a prison built from another person's grief and madness. Faced with the choice between continuing to live as someone else's creation or reclaiming her own identity, she made the only decision that felt like her own. On a cold February morning, she was found in the convent garden, having consumed a mixture of herbs that grew wild behind the chapel walls. In her hand was a note written in her own recovered handwriting. "My name was Bartolomea. I choose to die as myself rather than live as someone else's ghost." It was the first truly autonomous act she had performed in over 3 years. Her death was recorded in church records under both names, a final acknowledgement of the tragedy that had destroyed not 1 but 2 lives. The girl who died and the woman whose memory had been perverted into an instrument of torture. The story of Benedetta Carlini and her victim reveals how psychological manipulation can destroy lives just as effectively as any physical weapon. Hidden in monastery records and church archives are thousands of similar stories, tales of power, obsession, and human resilience that have been forgotten by history. These aren't just medieval curiosities, they're studies in the darkest aspects of human nature that remain relevant today. What other buried stories deserve to be brought into the light? What patterns of manipulation and survival might we recognize in our own world? Subscribe to explore more of these hidden historical accounts, and let me know in the comments, what forgotten story from history do you think needs to be told? The past has more secrets than we realize, and some of them can teach us crucial lessons about the present. Remember, the most important stories are often the ones that were deliberately hidden. Let's uncover them together.